Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. I am, of course, your host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Dr. Zada Komara. I got it right.
You got it right.
Yes. All right. Zada, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am an archaeologist of the recent past. I do contemporary and historic Appalachia and the Southeast generally. I teach for Southern University in an honors college, actually. I have kind of an interesting career in that I do not teach anthropology majors for the most part. I get like one a year, and I'm always like obsessed with this person. Mostly though, I teach interdisciplinary science. So I teach about pseudoscience, I teach about ritual myth and magic, modern material culture. Um, what else? I used to teach a race and gender in the material world class. That is, gone by the wayside in our current political moment. I teach a knowledge and society class, and I get to work archaeology into everything I do in whatever creative way is possible, which is how I went from doing largely late 19th, early 20th century Appalachian stuff in company coal mining towns to working on garbology, which is a form of contemporary archaeology where we study us.
So that brings us to what we're talking about today. So, garbology is the study of people's garbage, to put it simply. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. And if you think about it, all archaeology is the study of people's garbage, stuff that we either intentionally or unintentionally discarded that ends up as part of the archaeological record. And so it's kind of a natural extension, I think, to study modern people and their trash. And it has a pretty cool history if you want me to go into where this came from and why we would do such a thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. So there was a guy, Dr. Bill Rathje, in the 70s who was a Mayanist. I think he did lowland Maya stuff pretty exclusively. And he got really interested in some questions about the archaeological record regarding discard behavior that he couldn't answer just from the archaeological record alone. And he was like, well, I work with the contemporary Maya. He said, and also maybe, the average American's discard behavior, what they do with their trash could tell us something. And he started doing a couple cool projects. He started doing a project in Tucson, Arizona, where he went through people's curbside garbage cans. And everybody at the time was like, this dude has lost it. This dude has gone nuts. He wants to like look through people's trash. And then he got really interested in landfills and he went modern and he never went back. He pioneered the field of garbology. I have a colleague in the Southeast, Chris Poole, who had him as a student at Tulane, and he said this was always going to be Bill's trajectory. He loved anything that was gross. He used to have them like catalog like shells from shell middens that still like were disgusting. And then he just moved on to cigarette butts. And people, I think at first were like, this isn't archaeology, this isn't what we do. And then it became so wildly popular and so useful that now it's a subfield of archaeology. Like his original research got used for public health, looking at what people consumed. His research got used for all of this environmental policy, looking at how people dispose of waste. And so I think it's an awesome thing to be able to study modern people and to do something that actually benefits us today. Like, what can we learn about us today? What can we, as material culture scholars, help with, right? Beyond just looking at ketchup bottles from the early 20th century, which is cool, but frankly, not as transformative, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that brought to mind since you mentioned Tulane University, I read an article, I forgot who wrote it, but it was in the past 2 or 3 years that the state of Louisiana or just the city of New Orleans judges how successful a Mardi Gras is by how much trash it actually produces during the week.
Yeah. Oh, it's funny that you say that. I was just thinking about Kimberly Wooten, who's an archaeologist, who does a Mardi Gras bead project. So she goes out and maps the distribution of Mardi Gras beads afterwards. So there's another cool project out there. Lots of stuff that you could do in Mardi Gras. I think somebody else is doing masks, did pandemic masks in New Orleans, looking at how people discarded those.
So, what as archaeologists can we learn from studying other people's trash other than how one bad they are about recycling and us being really judgmental about it? What can we what besides giving us the moral high ground, what can we learn from studying their garbage?
I think we can learn a lot about consumer motivations and a lot about discard motivations. I think we can learn a lot about what people value and how we conceive of trash ontologically. So, for example, I do a garbology project on a college campus, and it's really interesting to me. We are a sustainable campus. We have all of these green initiatives. We have a recycling bin literally every 30 feet, and people do not recycle. They indiscriminately put things in both cans, and you will watch people litter like directly outside of a garbage can. And people litter pretty much anywhere that they are not being surveilled, has been my experience. So, any dark corner, any empty room in the library, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And if people don't feel like they will be culpable, they will not engage in these behaviors. And you could easily say, oh, this just means like people are crap, right? Which, that shouldn't be news to anyone. We're amazing and we're also crap. It does tell us, though, how we might want to reevaluate, sustainable green projects in public spaces. If people aren't using these things consistently, is that their failure? Is that a failure of design? Is there something that we need to understand about how people conceive of trash and how people conceive of disposal? And I think it also tells us a lot about public health. One thing that Rathje noticed in the 70s is that what people reported they did and what people did had a very far distance. And it wasn't always that people were lying intentionally. Sometimes they were. But he found that people often don't really know what they do. They know what they think they do. They think they recycle consistently. They think they eat very healthy. They don't think that they smoke and drink as much as they do. But the archaeological record tells a pretty different story. And if we want to actually do public health projects with a measurable impact, we have to have good data to start from, right? So I think looking at the material record is just a super valuable source of data to see what people actually consume as opposed to what they think they do.
And that brings me to the issue I was going to spotlight today is, a lot of archaeological sites, especially here in the Southeast, are not exactly public spaces, but people still go out to them and litter in them just the same. And that littering, that refuse still gets put into part of the narrative of the site because the story of those sites is still like an ongoing thing. Like the story of these sites doesn't stop just because people stop living there.
Right. Yeah, that's one thing that I like to remind students is that folks often just want to say, well, the past ended 50 years ago because that's historic preservation law, and that all modern refuse is just like it's overburden, it's an inconvenience, it's a nuisance. And it totally is. I'll go out to projects in really rural areas. I do some contract archaeology in the summer when I'm not teaching. And, sometimes there's so much modern garbage on sites that it's like, how do I even photograph this in a meaningful way? This cell company or this whatever utility company wants to come out here and they're trying to get like a proper view shed of the site. And there's just abandoned cars and there's just like dump piles of trash. And that is unfortunate. And I think it is really revealing when we find that stuff on archaeological sites. Again, of people's like ontological relationship with garbage, they consider the woods to be, I think, an away space, a hidden space, or maybe even a liminal space where the garbage exists, but it doesn't exist. And I think it tells us a lot about, our problems with infrastructure structure in the United States. People like to dump on rural areas, pun intended, saying, well, these people just don't understand, about environmentalism. And in a lot of cases, it's like, well, do you want to take, an hour and a half to drive your stuff to some transfer station in another county? Or are you going to do, what is most expedient when there's not the infrastructure there to take care of your problem? So I think modern refuse on archaeological sites is really interesting, even though I'll be honest, it is a nuisance. I think it's really interesting because it, number one, reminds us that there's no break in continuity between the past and the present, right? Like archaeological sites are also contemporary sites. And looking at what people decide to do there, I think is really useful and letting us know, how we can and should interact with the public. Like, for example, I go out on these projects, do a lot of cell tower projects, and I find a lot of garbage there that lets me know that hunters are trespassing and poaching all the time. And it's something that I can discuss with the landowner, and I think it gives us a really interesting window, into what people do consider public and private land, and to look at contemporary land use and to think about like, what our interactions with the public can look like because they're not all legal.
Yeah, I mean, especially here in the Southeast where, rural is rural. And, if you go out in the woods between probably November and February, you are likely to run into someone carrying a rifle. Whether they're legally doing so is beside the point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I just posted a video on TikTok about wearing as much high vis as possible. And I had bunch of contractors in my hotel say, like, what do you need all that for? Like, you're in the woods, you're not going to get hit by a car. And I was like, I'm just trying not to get shot during deer season. And it's one of those interactions that most people don't think about is that, you go back on a landowner's property to do work because they signed a cell tower lease. You may encounter other people who do not know about archaeology or may have a negative experience with archaeologists or are just startled to find a person there and don't quite know what to do with that interaction. And I don't know. I enjoy interactions with the public, even though sometimes they are kind of frightening, like especially during hunting season where you're like, oh man, what if they think I'm a deer? I don't know. Archaeology it's a mixed bag of like thrills and interesting times and boring times and transformative times. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, that's, one thing people get, anybody I've talked to on this program tells me is archaeology is never boring.
It is never boring. I do a garbology project, intentionally, not just like stuff I accidentally find in the woods, but the one that I do on a college campus, we wear more high vis than I almost ever do, except when it's deer season. And it's because I'm worried about us people getting hit by cars. It's so interesting that like in the modern world, we don't see things. We look at the ground for a living. We look at other people for a living. We are trained to be really observant, and that's not the case for most Americans. It's really revealing. We're out there looking at stuff, and if people notice us at all, they're like, "What are you doing? What are you looking at?" Because it's just weird to see people like in a group all day, not on their cell phones.
I mean, it's really rare to see a group of people wearing high vis orange and not be, tearing up a roadway or something.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I like those conversations with the public. Sometimes I think if you want to do better with public outreach as an archaeologist, you should just wear a high vis vest, when you teach or when you go to Walmart, and people will be like, "What are you doing?" Like people always ask about it, and I think that's a really good entry point into saying, "I'm working here," and then people almost always say, like, "I didn't know we had any archaeology there."
Now, see, the response I give to people, I tell them it's called style.
It is also called style. I mean,
Yeah,
we look good as heck out there.
I mean, there's nothing like going to like a bar or something after, being in the woods for 12 hours covered in a layer of red clay and high vis orange and thinking
Uh-huh.
this should be my dating profile picture.
It actually should be. There is no time that I feel more powerful than I do in full Carhartts tracking mud through some rural gas station. I just feel untouchable. And everybody like they give you the eye like, look, you piece of garbage, like get out of here, track a mud all over the floor. And I just have this like ultimate sense of power. Like I am here, I am disgusting, and I am a scientist. Like, welcome.
Okay, but people who are watching this take into account that the reason we dress like that is because we have more pockets than you do and we know it.
So many pockets.
Like pockets on top of pockets. And when you're an archaeologist, you need all of the pockets. Like if you can take pockets from other
Hmm.
people, please do so.
Hmm. Yep.
Hmm. But back to garbology, I was thinking as far as like chronologically, it's really helpful to see like
Mm.
when the last time somebody actually came traipsing through a site is, because if you find a Coca-Cola bottle, these are my favorites as far as, garbage goes, because the design is very distinct. And if it's like a bottle design from the 80s, you can assume that somebody had been there up until that point. But if you're not finding any trash newer than that, then that's a question.
Yeah, I do find modern refuse to be really helpful. I was out on a project a couple weeks ago. I was like, oh, this is so beautiful, rural West Virginia. This is relatively undisturbed, which I was surprised about given that it was owned by a farmer. And they were putting in a cell tower, and I had written like undisturbed at the beginning of my field notes, and then dug like my 14th shovel test, and literally 30 centimeters down, I was like, that is a modern pop tab. I mean, like 2000s. I was like, started to look around. I was like, yeah, I think he's done some grading out here that we hadn't considered. And it was, it's kind of cool when you get sort of slapped in the face with the reality that people have always been around and they always will be around. And no matter how remote that you feel that you are, you are looking at an anthropogenic landscape, basically.
And that's kind of how you and I and thousands of other people stay employed, is people keep throwing things out. Just like
I
before
know.
there was actual trash collection, when we say threw it out, people literally would dig a hole and throw it out.
Yeah, this is funny. I mean, obviously, as archaeologists, we talk to each other about this all the time. We say, what is our field going to look like in 200 years, right? Where we've really, cracked down environmentally on littering and dumping on private and public land. Is that what is going to be left for us? Are we all going to be excavating landfills? I am both pleased and horrified, I think, to suggest to you that we will always be employed until we come up with the utopian solution to trash management. I think that we will always be employed. And until we have, large scale buy-in for environmentalism, people will continue to litter because it's something that we have seen for thousands of years on this continent. And I gather ancient people weren't really conceptualizing it the same way, leaving a lithic scatter in an area. They probably weren't like, yo, I'm littering, bro. But if you think about it, there's not as much distance as we would like to hope between, that ancient flint knapper and like kids partying behind their local high school and throwing McDonald's wrappers on the ground.
I'm just picturing someone who has like no concept of like refuse. Like, I'm making a conscious choice to leave that flint piece there. It is my choice, and my
Yeah.
people have to respect it.
Right. I always hope like, back in the ancient past, somebody was like, somebody's gonna find this one day and they're gonna be like, this dude napped so hard here. And it's like, ancient Brian is like, I'm gonna make sure this is a really big pile of flakes. So somebody knows, that I did a really good job. Because, I don't think that's, wild to suggest because I see that refuse behavior when I study garbology. I find, alcoholic beverage containers everywhere in public space. And some of times I find them stacked in pyramids. I find them set very intentionally out on the surface with like other kinds of paraphernalia. I think I find graffiti. I find graffiti everywhere in conjunction with other activities. And I think that, humans have always kind of wanted to signal. I mean, there's no like universal behavior, but I think that it's fun for humans to say, I was here. I did this thing. This is the material record of me. Encounter it.
Or, they get really creative with it and they make like a bottle tree out of Smirnoff bottles.
Yeah. I have students, I drive, through this like housing that's before the university when I get to work. And when it's nice weather, everybody has their beer pong table outside. And everything that they had at a party is still in the yard. And one day I was talking to one of my students was the president of one of these fraternities. And I was like, it's kind of wild how much stuff you guys leave in the yard. And he said, well, how else are people going to know that these are ragers and that they want to pay the cover to come to our parties and they want to rush our fraternities and that ladies want to come over. And I was like, you know what? I hadn't thought of it in that way. Like that's, have you ever seen that Onion article? Archaeologists find evidence of like an epic rager, and it's about this party that happened by the train tracks, and it's circulated an oral narrative from like older brother to younger brother, and archaeologists are out there looking at all of these beer cans and like, we know this was an epic rager, like because of X, Y, and Z, because of artifact distribution, because of oral history. And that's how I look at those frat parties now when I drive past their apartment complexes. I'm like, you know what? The epic rager has quite a material signature, and it's doing something in the contemporary world. And someday, we are going to be digging that up. Like we will be that Onion article for real. And you can do it now. That's my plug for Garbology, is you can study that stuff now. If you are an archaeologist, and I don't care what level you are at, if you are an undergrad to a PhD holding professional, if you are a Forest Service archaeologist, if you work for the Army Corps, there is always a space to do Garbology. And I think it's always really evocative because it's the remains of us. It's our communities. It's people we know. We know stuff when we see it. And it's also really exciting when you see things that you have never heard of before.
Yeah, and
And you're
that's
like, what is this thing? And where are people getting it?
and it's really fun to like see people's faces. They kind of blush when you like my undergrad advisor, she did like a little week of garbology and had students bring their trash from their dorm room. And it was obvious that some
Yeah.
of them were trying to hide their shame during the lesson. But then the rest of them were like straight up bragging about it because they brought in like a Dollar General, bag of nothing like smearing off bottles and condom wrappers.
Right? Yeah, I actually do an in-class garbology exercise with my freshman seminar. And I bring in samples of garbage, and they're all from, the town where I live. That's all I tell them. I say, this is collected within the last 3 months, and it's from here, somewhere in our municipal area. And a couple times I have used my own garbage just because it was easier. I often go out to the frat houses and I clean up their yard after an epic rager. And I think it's cool to like contrast that with like a single family residential sample. And just listening to them go through my trash is just so funny. And it's so interesting how spot on they usually are. They'll say, well, this is a woman. And I'm like, yeah. And I hear them go, and she's white. I'm like, how did you know? And they're like, I mean, look at this, this is a bougie white woman because she's got a lot of stuff in here from the Asian store, but this is not an Asian woman. Like, this is somebody with a college degree. Like, this is a professional. This is a white woman. And they're always like, and she's in her 60s. And I'm like, hey, wait a minute. I just think it's just like kind of funny, what we can infer from garbage and what we can't. And one thing I love about Garbology is it really gets us to think about our own assumptions about the past, about the ancient past, about what we call the historic period. It gets us to really think about how interpretations work and how we could build more solid foundations for, extrapolating to the ancient past.
So, if people wanted to get interested in garbology, first of all, I'm not asking people to actually go root through other people's garbage. You do need permission to do that. So don't do that. But if people wanted to study like garbology as a practice, again, without actually going out and collecting what I assume is rusty nails and razor sharp things, please don't do that because that's how you get tetanus. What would you recommend they do?
Number one, look, a quick Google search will bring up some archaeology projects. There's a contemporary archaeology project in Christchurch, for example, where they looked at the impact of natural disasters and they have mapped, contemporary refugees all over the city. There's several projects in New Orleans doing things like mapping Mardi Gras beads. You can find mine pretty easily, and I will take volunteers anytime. I want to do another like follow-up garbology project this summer. And you're welcome to share my contact info with folks. If you want a cool line on your CV that is pretty like high impact archaeology for like a low amount of physical labor, come out with me this summer. You're also welcome to volunteer with me next spring. And I would say that I find garbology to be really accessible to beginning professionals. For example, the project that I do on campus is no collect. We do not collect anything. It is a mapping only project. So you do not have to touch anything gross. Also, I give students grabbers so that they can pull, nasty Dunkin' Donuts, frappes, whatever they call their frappuccino. Some stuff gets gross. And sometimes you find like bottles with tobacco spit in them. So I just give them grabbers and gloves. But like other than that, we just use handheld GIS. We use ArcGIS Survey 123, which is a program you can easily put on your cell phone. Just think about what your research question is. Look around your community and ask yourself, what are persistent places on the landscape? Where are people littering and why? And what might I want to learn from this? And you take your phone and you go out with ArcGIS and you go out with your camera on your phone and wear your vest, as we're talking, Daniel and I are talking about here. You want to be wearing high vis, even in urban areas, and just start mapping. And this will put you at the forefront of garbology because not enough people are doing this kind of work, even though I think it's got an awesomely like low entry point. This is a good place to learn about artifacts too, because a lot of what we see in the contemporary past, 5 minutes ago, will help you learn historic artifact analysis. So if you're looking at, European sites post-invasion, this will help you like with artifact typology.
So if somebody wanted to start a project like this, I assume they would still need to get landowner permission, even though they're not actually excavating, right?
Yeah, unless it's public space, if it's public land, if you want to take your cell phone out into the national forest and you want to start mapping litter, I bet the Forest Service would be jazzed about that, number one. I bet they would love your data, but that's public land. You're there. Somebody dropped that. You can absolutely, take a GPS point on that with your phone. If you want to go through somebody's curbside garbage can, yes, absolutely, you need landowner permission. You do not want people calling the police on you. Nobody ever wants to deal with the police. It's just, they show up and you're in high vis and you're like holding someone's beer can out of their garbage. It's like it takes a lot of work to convince them that you are a professional. Ask me how I know. But yeah, you need landowner permission if you want to work on private land. But I find it relatively easy to get. People are interested to know what an archaeologist would want to know about them and modern life. And people love to talk to you about their own lives, is something that I find. More often than not, people are like, I do want to tell you why I had, the Balls Outrager. That was the title from the Onion article. Why I had a Balls Outrager, right outside the ring of college campus. Let us tell you of the epic kegger.
Oh my God, I'm just imagining the documentation for the Rager that gets submitted to the state along with the record and the site number, and then in parentheses next to it, it just has Epic Rager.
Epic Rager.
Oh,
That's actually a goal of mine. So, maybe 20 years from now, when we're looking at frat parties from the 80s and 90s, like legally under historic preservation law, like the Epic Rager site will be my first site name.
yeah, here in the Southeast, it'll be Big Sandy and then Epic Rager right under it.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, well, Zeta, it has been wonderful having you on the show. This has been a really fun episode.
Oh, great. Folks, hit me up. If you want to learn how to do this, start a project in your own community. I'm happy to give you everything that I've learned. And this was really fun. I enjoyed talking about this. People mostly want to interview me about Appalachian coal towns, and I'm going to be honest, my heart has kind of shifted almost totally into contemporary archaeology at this point. So it's nice to be asked about shotgun beer cans.
Wait, we have coal here in the Southeast?
Oh my goodness, so much.
Okay, that's news to me, and that's what my next research project is.
Yeah. Yeah, I primarily worked in Eastern Kentucky. That makes sense. I'm a Kentuckian. I do a lot more work in West Virginia than other areas. So yeah, I've historically studied coal mining towns, which is interesting because I see a lot of the same discard behavior, where people like to throw trash into areas they think no one will go. So if there's like a holler nearby where people aren't living, there's no houses, that's where the trash goes. If there is an abandoned lot behind your apartment complex and you are throwing the balls out, Rager, guess what? That's where your trash goes.
Well, everybody, that is going to do it for us on this episode of Archaeology After Dark. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for supporting the work that we continue to do.